if this decay and decline on the north side of St. Louis was not essentially legislated by the city, how did it happen? After all, much of today's North St. Louis looks like the result of the benign neglect the Team 4 plan is accused of promoting. Well, as it turns out, mandates were not needed to essentially follow the plan, which called on the cash-strapped city to take resources out of poor, predominantly African-American neighborhoods and focus them elsewhere.
Was it implemented?
I would say yes.
Bob Lewis, current SLU professor and former Team 4 consultant, says this all happened largely because of math. Even without legislation, city policy and private development were going to gravitate naturally toward areas that provided the most potential bang for the buck. Very few of those financially promising areas were in African-American neighborhoods.
So I can understand the emotions that came out of reading the policies recommended in that 74 plan, and can understand even to this day why they're still hanging around, partly because it's still general policy anyway, whether anybody is acknowledging it or not.
And Team 4 is typical of what a lot of cities did at the time. It's like, well, we don't have money to buy up the blighted land. We don't have money to put anything in its place. What can we do?
Here's the question.
Colin Gordon is a researcher. He wrote the book Mapping Decline, which documents the erosion of North St. Louis, among other places, over the last 5 decades. He had a team in town researching another book recently. He says as the years went on in the 1970s and beyond, St. Louis's problems were not changing, and much of what Team 4 had proposed, those depletion areas the plan had discussed, still were viewed as lacking in a financial future, not so much because they were black, but because they were poor.
No one really wants to accommodate the poor. They just want a better use of the land that the poor is occupying. They want higher tax revenues out of it and higher use. So you're really talking about the distribution of resources within a metropolitan area. And that, I think, makes the idea of planning for decline on that sort of local basis a little more obnoxious and sort of racially tinged. The idea that you're going to allow some neighborhoods to die and even withdraw services.
It's been called by many a racist undertaking. Was it that in your eyes?
I don't think that it was racially motivated, but I think it reflected a deeply racist pattern of public and private policy that had created the problem in the first place.
In other words, these areas became poor to begin with due to the policies of racism that date back not years, but centuries.
Oh, they've tried to kill that North St. Louis a long time ago.
Freeman Bosley Sr., now well into his 80s, can recall those days long before Team 4 had even been thought of.
Certain areas of the city, particularly those south of Delmar, the building inspectors would go in and check those buildings out. But between Delmar up to St. Louis Avenue, they just let that go to hell in a handbasket, because they knew at one time or another that would run down to the point where they could come in there and not necessarily through eminent domain, but just the properties would get so bad that the city could just take them over. People that had money that were up in this area between Delmar, Dr. Martin Luther King, King's Highway, those people moved out.
So by the time those board bills and then the Team 4 plan itself came and went, poor neighborhoods in St. Louis, particularly on the north side, were mostly African American and had been for years. And while those folks were able to mobilize politically to stop the Board of Aldermen from implementing the Team 4 plan as law, they could only guard against its concepts for so long.
People go on with their daily life. They can't afford to just sit there and just constantly watch what the city is doing 24/7.
And as the 70s turned into the 80s and 90s, city leaders, a little bit at a time, possibly without even realizing it, were doing exactly what the Team 4 plan had proposed, taking resources away from areas already in the worst shape. Some call it urban triage, others benign neglect.
It seems very much like what was being discussed and talked about during that particular time. Remove the services. You didn't have as much garbage pickup. You wouldn't have as much any of the other city services, pavement of streets and things of that nature. And then eventually folks will become so disgusted where they will move on their own.
Certainly wasn't intended to deprive them of fundamental city services, police protection, garbage collection, fire protection, building enforcement, code enforcement, and so forth. It's more the reinvestment side of things. Taking community development kinds of monies, for example, and saying this is where we're actually going to support development because we can leverage on strengths that are nearby.
One of the ironies of the Team 4 is much of what they argued became very popular a generation later, when smaller industrial cities like Youngstown and Dayton started adopting what they called sort of smart decline strategies, where they said, well, look, we're not going to get any more population. And so we have this blighted, largely abandoned part of the city. Let's turn it into a park.
We should take better care of our neighborhoods.
But there are plenty who believe the racial element of this was not an accident or an oversight.
They must have also realized that blacks were enormously discriminated against in terms of employment and jobs and bank loans and things of that nature that would allow for any group of people to be able to maintain or to keep things up.
And so, like a sort of death by 1,000 cuts, the downward slide of these neighborhoods continued with little apparent hope for change. That's until the early 21st century arrived and a new name arrived with it, Paul McKee. But would he be a savior or a slumlord? We'll look into that in our next report. George Sells, MetroSTL.com.